Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Shadows. The solicitor's letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed in black wax that felt obscene against the pastel wallpaper of her childhood bedroom. Eleanor Ashford held it between trembling fingers, the parchment thick and antique, utterly wrong in her small Cambridge flat. To the last living heir of the Ashford bloodline, it began. Her mother had been cremated 3 weeks ago. Eleanor had scattered her ashes in the Cam River, watched them dissolve into ordinary water, and thought that was the end of it. That was the mercy she'd expected from a woman who'd spent her entire life speaking only in whispers about the family shame and debts unpaid. Now, apparently, there were estates, debts that didn't die with the living. The drive to Yorkshire took 5 hours, and Eleanor spent every mile wondering if she was walking toward inheritance or damnation. Her mother had forbidden her from ever visiting Ravenscroft Manor. "That place feeds on the living," she'd said once, delirious with fever. "Your grandfather, God forgive him, he made a covenant. We don't go back." But Eleanor had nowhere else to go. Her job at the university library was temporary. Her boyfriend had left her for someone more ambitious. Her mother's funeral debts exceeded her savings. And apparently, she had a Victorian mansion in the Yorkshire moors that the solicitors valued at approximately £2 million. The gates appeared first, wrought iron twisted into shapes that might have been roses or might have been screams. Beyond them, the drive curved through overgrown woodland where the afternoon light couldn't quite penetrate. The trees were gnarled and ancient, their bark silver-black as if they'd been scorched by something other than time. Ravenscroft rose from the moorland like a breath held for 3 centuries. The mansion was larger than she'd imagined. 4 stories of pale stone gone gray with age, its windows like closed eyes. Ivy consumed the eastern wing. The western turret was missing its peak, as if some catastrophe had simply bitten it off. And everywhere, there were gargoyles, hunched on the eaves, perched on chimneys, their stone mouths open in silent hunger. Eleanor parked her sensible Prius in front and sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart performing an unfamiliar rhythm against her ribs. The doors opened, no one had touched them when she approached. "Impossible," she whispered, but her voice sounded small in the cavernous foyer. Dust particles hung suspended in the amber light that filtered through stained glass. The air smelled of old velvet, extinguished candles, and something else. Something metallic and ancient, like a tomb that had never quite learned to rest. The solicitor had given her keys and a list of valuables catalogued by her great-grandfather in 1887. There was mention of a restricted archive in the East Crypt, sealed by family law. Eleanor was not to enter without explicit permission from the resident guardian. As if the house were occupied, the foyer's grand staircase split into 2 ascending paths, like a throat opening to swallow her whole. Portraits lined the walls, Ashfords dating back centuries, their eyes following her with the particular accusation of the permanently dead. One portrait, larger than the others, hung above the mantelpiece. It showed a man in 19th century dress, dark hair, pale skin, eyes that were almost gray, almost silver, eyes that held the weight of empires. The nameplate read, Lord Adrian Ashford, 1756, no death date. Eleanor leaned closer, squinting at the canvas. The paint was masterful, almost unsettlingly alive. In the depths of those gray eyes, she could swear she saw something moving. A candle flame, a memory, a hunger that predated language. A sound reached her from above. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending through the upper darkness. Eleanor's breath caught. The solicitor had assured her the house was empty, sealed since 1952. She'd given no permission to anyone, had told no one she was coming. The footsteps reached the landing. A shadow moved across the stained glass, and for a moment, the afternoon light turned the color of blood. He emerged into the foyer like a closing revelation. He was tall, painfully so, with the kind of posture that suggested centuries of bearing the weight of thrones on shoulders that had long since learned not to shrug. His skin held the translucence of marble kept always in shadow. His hair was black and fell to his shoulders in waves that seemed almost deliberately romantic. And his eyes, God. His eyes were the same gray as the portrait above, ancient and fathomless as a midnight well. He wore a burgundy smoking jacket that might have been fashionable in 1920, or might have been old enough to have attended Mozart's funeral. Eleanor's mouth went dry. Her heart, which had been performing arrhythmias, simply stopped its rhythm entirely. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was soft, the whisper of curtains drawn against daylight, but it carried through the foyer as if he'd never learned to speak at anything less than full authority. The covenant requires, I inherited, Eleanor heard herself say. Her voice sounded like someone else's, braver. The solicitors said I'm the last Ashford. They said this was mine. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Something flickered in those ancient eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or hunger, or something that contained both and had no modern name. Then you've inherited more than property, he said quietly. You've inherited a debt written in blood. And he stepped closer. Eleanor could smell him now. Candle wax and night air and something beneath it. Something that made her primitive brain shriek warnings even as another part of her, some treacherous, foolish part, stepped toward him. I'm the collection agent, he finished. The chandelier above them swayed, though there was no wind. Dust fell like snow. Eleanor opened her mouth to ask what he meant. But he was fading already, moving backward into the shadows of the eastern corridor. In seconds, he'd vanished as if he'd never been more than an echo, a ghost, a threat made manifest. But his final words hung in the amber dust like a curse. Welcome home, Eleanor Ashford. I've been waiting for your bloodline to return for exactly 173 years. Chapter 2. The Dark Pull. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She'd locked herself in one of the guest bedrooms, a pale blue confection with faded damask wallpaper and a 4-poster bed that creaked like arthritic bones whenever she shifted. Every shadow held teeth. Every silence held breath. The man the thing had known her name without introduction, had known the exact span of years he'd waited. Eleanor had run through explanations like a rosary. Family research, social media stalking, hired investigators. Nothing quite fit the peculiar certainty in his voice. The way he'd spoken her name as if it were a password he'd been waiting 173 years to unlock. She'd tried to leave around midnight. Made it as far as the foyer before something, not force, but something gentler and far more effective had convinced her the roads were impassable. The gatehouse windows showed only white static, a fog so absolute it seemed intentional. When she'd placed her hand against the cold glass, she could have sworn she felt it pull, the way a lover's gravity pulls you close. By 3 a.m, she'd accepted that the manor wanted her to stay. Now, in the gray-blue pre-dawn, Eleanor stood before the portrait of Lord Adrian Ashford. Without the afternoon light's drama, it was somehow more unsettling. The artist had captured something that shouldn't be capturable in oils and canvas. The paradox of beauty and emptiness, of elegance and starvation. You're him, aren't you? The portrait offered no answer. Eleanor had always been the sort of woman who talked to herself, to books, to mirrors, never expecting response, but finding it comforting nonetheless. Talking to Victorian paintings seemed like a natural escalation of that harmless habit. Why? She asked. What does a debt written in blood even mean? What did my great-grandfather do? The house creaked around her, settling into its eternal ache. Eleanor had spent the night reading the catalogued items in the foyer's display cases, all original. The card explained, dating to the estate's establishment in 1756. Beneath Victorian landscapes and first editions, there were older things. A crystal chalice that seemed to contain swirled wine that never settled, a ribbon of black silk stained what might be burgundy or might be blood. A leather journal with pages she wasn't brave enough to open, and a photograph. Her great-grandfather, stern-faced and young, standing beside a woman with Eleanor's exact eyes and hair. On the back, in faded ink, with my love eternal, even unto damnation. A. 1843. The initials matched the portrait. The handwriting trembled with emotion, or age, or both. Eleanor. She spun. He stood in the library doorway, the Eastern Library, the one the solicitor's letter had warned contained restricted archives. His morning appearance was no less unsettling than his twilight manifestation. In the early light, she could see the faint network of veins beneath his translucent skin, visible as if drawn in silver ink. His eyes were less gray now and more colorless, like water holding nothing but reflection. You shouldn't be awake, he said. It wasn't an accusation. Humans sleep. It's one of their few dignities. I couldn't sleep. Eleanor's voice surprised her with its steadiness. I kept thinking about blood debts, and 173-year waits, and how insane this all sounds. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face. It didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps nothing could reach those eyes anymore. Your great-grandfather made a choice, he said, stepping into the library proper. Eleanor noted the way he avoided the windows, keeping to shadow. In 1843, he was dying. Consumption, they called it then. His wife, he gestured to the photograph, was already gone. Your family line was ending. So he came to me, here in this house, and he asked for a covenant, life for life. His daughter's immortality in exchange for the freedom of my damnation. Eleanor's mouth was dry. Immortality? You're saying he wanted to turn your bloodline into vampires? His tone was almost gentle, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. Yes, a crude term, but functionally accurate. I told him no. The gift I carry is not one to share lightly. It is hunger and burning and the daily agony of watching the world transform while you remain fixed in amber. I would not curse his child with it. He moved to the window, pressed his palm against the glass. Where his skin touched, the pain frosted white, so he made another covenant instead. If I would protect his bloodline for 7 generations, if I would keep them safe from the hunters, from the covens, from every threat that circled the Ashford name like wolves, then they would give me access to their blood. Once every generation, one of them would come to me willingly, and I would feed. He turned back to her, and his eyes held something ancient and terrible. A bargain between sustenance and stewardship. And now, Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. The implication hung between them like a dropped chandelier, waiting to crash. Now, he said quietly, I find myself uncertain. The covenant has sustained me for 7 generations. Your mother was supposed to be the last. She was supposed to come to me 6 years ago, on her 30th birthday. Instead, she ran. She rejected the blood debt, married a mortal man, had you in secret, and spent her entire life telling you to fear this place. His voice held no anger, only a profound sadness. She broke the covenant. And that means I'm obligated? Eleanor heard the hysteria rising in her voice. I'm supposed to just accept that I'm… What? Cattle? A food source? A 7-generation loophole? You're supposed to be nothing, he said, and the simple truth of it struck her harder than any accusation. Your mother's rejection broke the blood oath. You should be free. The fog should have released you this morning. You should be driving away from Ravenscroft, never to return. But I'm not, Eleanor whispered. I tried. Something stopped me. Yes. He moved closer, and Eleanor felt that pull again, not physical, but something deeper. Something that resonated in her bones, in her blood, in the secret places where her cells remembered things her conscious mind had never learned. Something stopped you. And I don't know what it is. For the first time, he looked uncertain, almost afraid. His hand lifted as if to touch her, then fell away, as if contact would confirm something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The covenant promised me a bloodline, he continued, his voice barely audible. 7 generations of willing sacrifice. But there was no mention of this. No provision for… He paused, searching for a word that didn't exist. For pulling. Eleanor understood, in that moment, that she terrified him, not as prey, but as something far more dangerous, as a variable, an unknown, a violation of rules that had held him steady through centuries of loss. What happens now? She asked. His gray eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not hunger but longing, the kind that had been starving for 173 years. Now, he said softly, we discover why. The window behind him shattered. Not from force, but from the heat of sudden sun breaking through the dissipating fog. Light poured across his shoulders, and he gasped a sound of agony and fled toward the shadows, toward the eastern corridor, toward the darkness that had claimed him so long ago. Eleanor stood alone in the library, her great-grandfather's love letter still in her hand, understanding nothing except this. She was no longer certain which one of them was the predator. Chapter 3. The Immortal Stranger. Eleanor found him in the crypt. She hadn't meant to venture into the restricted archives truly. She'd promised herself she wouldn't. But the manor had other ideas. Doors that should have been locked swung open at her approach. Corridors she hadn't noticed before revealed themselves in the afternoon shadows. It was as if Ravenscroft itself was conspiring to pull her deeper into its mysteries. And Eleanor, exhausted from a day of pretending normalcy, had simply surrendered to the current. The entrance was behind the library's eastern wall, concealed by a panel of mahogany that slid open at her touch like a mouth. Stone steps descended into darkness that no electric torch could quite penetrate. The air changed as she descended, cooler, yes, but also heavier, weighted with something older than oxygen. By the time her feet reached the crypt floor, Eleanor's breath came shallow and quick, as if she were breathing liquid. The crypt itself was vast, a cathedral of the dead. Tombs lined the walls in neat stone rows, their lids carved with effigies of Ashfords across centuries, but it was the central chamber that stopped her breath entirely. He lay on a stone slab in the center of the chamber, absolutely still, as if carved from the very marble he rested upon. Candlelight candles that had somehow ignited upon her descent, though she'd seen no one light them, illuminated the scene with operatic drama. His burgundy jacket was open, exposing the pale landscape of his chest, and there, directly over his heart, was a wound. It was ancient, the skin around it scarred white and silver, but it was open, and from it wept a darkness that might have been blood, or might have been the essence of night itself. Where the darkness fell onto the stone, it hissed and smoked like acid. "You're dying," Eleanor said. The observation emerged clinical, her librarian's mind asserting itself over the hysteria clawing at her throat. "You've been dying for years, centuries, maybe. This wound, holy water," he said without opening his eyes. "A priest's blessing, delivered by a hunter in 1851. It lodges in the heart, and it burns, not quickly enough to grant mercy, but thoroughly enough to guarantee suffering." His voice was different now, thinner, as if the speaking cost him. Eleanor moved closer, and with each step, the pull intensified. It was no longer a gentle gravity but a hook, a rope, a chain being drawn taut. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you're here." Finally, his eyes opened. They were darker now, less silver and more the color of storm clouds. "And because I can feel you trying to understand, the way your blood is trying to understand mine. The Covenant's language is singing in your cells, Eleanor. It's been singing since you arrived. You feel it, don't you? That pull." She did. God help her, she did. It was beneath her ribs, a compass needle spinning wildly toward true north. It was in her fingertips, burning to touch him. It was in her throat, an ache that suggested it could only be soothed by something she wasn't brave enough to name. "My mother ran because she felt it too," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question. Your mother felt it and was wise enough to fear it." He tried to sit up, and the effort nearly destroyed him. His entire body convulsed, that dark blood weeping faster from the wound at his chest. "The Covenant is not merely a transaction, Eleanor. It's a blood binding. 7 generations, each willing to give of themselves, created a chain, and you," he gasped, clutching at his ribs, "you are the final link in that chain. Your blood remembers what your conscious mind never learned." Eleanor was moving before she could think, kneeling beside him on the stone slab. This close, she could smell him properly. Not the candle wax and night air she'd noticed before, but something richer, darker, like iron and earth and the metallic sting of lightning, like nothing human, like hunger. "What happens if I—" She couldn't finish it, couldn't say the words that were forming in her mouth, born from a place deeper than reason. "If you offer?" His hand found hers, and the contact was electric. Her fingers convulsed in his grip. "If you willingly shed your blood for mine, the covenant completes. The binding becomes whole, and I would be healed. And then," Eleanor's voice shook, "then you would be bound to me, not as cattle to a predator, but as—" He paused, searching for a word, as 2 souls twisted together at the root. "You would feel what I feel, know what I know. Your life would be measured against my immortality, and you would watch the world change while you remained fixed beside me." His grip tightened. "Your mother chose to run from that fate. Are you brave enough to choose it?" Eleanor looked at their joined hands. Where his pale skin touched hers, she could see the faint map of veins beneath the surface, silver and dark, pulsing with something that shouldn't be alive but undeniably was. And beneath her own skin, responding to his touch, her veins seemed to glow the same color. "I don't even know you," she whispered. "You know me," he said, and something in his tone suggested he wasn't being metaphorical. "Your blood knows me. Your cells remember me. Every Ashford woman before you knew me like this in the moment of the blood covenant. All their memories would flow into me. Their lives, their loves, their terrors. And I would know them absolutely. But you—" His other hand lifted to her face, traced the line of her cheekbone with fingers that trembled. "You are the first one who makes me uncertain. You pull at something I didn't know was still tethered in me." Eleanor leaned into his touch. The heat of it was shocking, not warm, as she'd expected, but burning cold, the kind of cold that existed at the heart of deep space, at the bottom of ancient oceans. And it felt like coming home. "Tell me your name," she said. "Your real name. Not Lord Adrian, or the cursed Lord. Tell me who you were before the wound, before the hunger, before the covenant. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, his lips moved around syllables that seemed to hurt him. Nathaniel. My name was Nathaniel Ashford, and I was human once, in a time when the world was younger, and cruelty seemed like a reasonable price for immortal love. Eleanor felt something break open inside her chest. Not pain exactly, but rupture, the kind that happens when two separate things suddenly recognize themselves as fragments of a single broken whole. Eleanor, he said, and his voice held a question and a warning and a prayer all at once. If you offer your blood to me, understand this. You will save my life, but you will also bind yours to my damnation. You will be my tether to the world, and I will be the hunger that never quite releases you. I understand, she lied. She understood nothing. She understood everything. She understood that the moment she'd inherited Ravenscroft, her fate had been written in blood and darkness and the terrible mathematics of love that transcended mortality. She lifted her wrist to her lips, bit down until she tasted copper, and offered the wound to him. His fangs descended like a confession, and he drank as if he were drinking starlight, as if she were the only thing that had ever tasted like redemption. Chapter 4. The unraveling past. The transformation began 3 days later. Eleanor first noticed it in the mirror, a faint silvering at the edges of her veins, visible beneath the skin of her wrists like moonlight trapped in glass. The effect was subtle enough that she might have dismissed it as a trick of Ravenscroft's perpetually strange lighting, except for the hunger. It started as a whisper in her throat, a dryness that water couldn't touch. By the second day, it had become a roaring need that made her lightheaded and furious. She found herself staring at the kitchen staff, a small, bewildered contingent who'd appeared after the covenant, as if summoned by Nathaniel's healing, noting the pulse at their necks with an interest that horrified her. On the third day, she'd locked herself in her bedroom and wept with the frustration of an appetite she didn't understand and couldn't control. Nathaniel came to her as the sun set, slipping through shadows that seemed to part for him like curtains. "It's beginning," he said simply, and there was no apology in his voice, only acknowledgement. He looked healthier. The wound at his chest had closed to a thin scar, and color had returned to his cheeks. Her blood had done that. Her sacrifice had literally saved his life. The knowledge was both intoxicating and terrifying. What's beginning? Eleanor was curled on her bed in a nest of blankets, trying to contain the violence of her own hunger. "What's happening to me?" "The covenant," Nathaniel said, moving to the window. He stood in silhouette against the dying light, his form so perfectly still he seemed more statue than man. "When an Ashford woman gave her blood willingly, the binding created a pathway. Your ancestors' sacrifice opened a door in your bloodline that would allow you to survive my bite, to carry my blood within yours without being destroyed by it. But the covenant was never meant to create a half-transformation. It was meant to be a transaction, blood for protection, nothing more." "But I'm not half-transformed," Eleanor said. The hunger surged again, and she bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. The taste of it, her own copper-warm blood, sent a shockwave of need through her that made her gasp. "I'm becoming something else." "Yes." Nathaniel turned from the window, and in the gathering darkness, his eyes began to glow. Not with light exactly, but with absence, like looking at the sky through a hole in reality. "Because you're not like the others. The covenant never spoke of this, but I should have seen it. I should have understood the moment the pull manifested between us." He moved to her bedside and knelt, bringing those impossible eyes level with hers. This close, Eleanor could see the faint network of silver veins beneath his skin, could feel the cold radiating from him like the breath of winter. "Your great-grandfather made a covenant," Nathaniel continued, but the language was older than either of us understood. "The priest who blessed me, the one who delivered the holy water that created this wound, he didn't just curse me to suffer. He bound me to seek redemption through the very bloodline that served me. He made me an agent of their transformation, as much as their protector." "What does that mean?" Eleanor whispered. "It means," Nathaniel said, and his voice held centuries of sorrow, "that the seventh generation wasn't meant to be merely the final payment of the covenant. The seventh generation was meant to be the transformation, the culmination, the moment when the blood binding could be made complete, not through transaction, but through true union." Eleanor pulled back from him. "You're saying I'm not becoming a vampire because of what you are. You're saying I'm becoming a vampire because of what I am. Your bloodline remembers what it was before the covenant," Nathaniel said quietly. "Before your great-grandfather made his desperate bargain, the Ashfords were guardians of something older. They kept the threshold between the mortal world and the shadow realms. They were half-born themselves, touched by the old blood, marked by the ancient compact between human and immortal. Your great-grandfather tried to deny that heritage, tried to create a purely human lineage. But blood doesn't forget, Eleanor. Genetics doesn't forgive denial. He stood and moved to the wardrobe, opening it to reveal clothes. Eleanor didn't recognize a gown of deep burgundy silk, pre-Victorian incut, with corseting that suggested it had been crafted for a specific body. These belonged to the first Ashford woman to enter the Covenant. They've been preserved here for 180 years, waiting. They were made for the night she came to me, willingly, knowing what she was entering, knowing what she was becoming. Eleanor rose on unsteady legs and approached the gown. The moment her fingers touched the silk, a flood of sensation crashed through her, not her memories, but someone else's. A woman's terror and exhilaration, her fear and desperate love, her final choice made in a candlelit crypt, exactly like this one. Eleanor gasped and jerked her hand back. But it was too late. The vision had bloomed in her mind like a flower opening to moonlight. The blood memories, Nathaniel confirmed. The Covenant creates a bloodline chain. Each woman who offered herself to me passed something to the next generation, not just genetic material, but memory itself. Your mother tried to break that chain by refusing me, but the memories remain embedded in your cells. They recognize me. They recognize what you are. Stop. Eleanor held up her hand. Just stop. Are you telling me that I'm not choosing this? That I was always meant to become this? That I have no agency in my own transformation? Nathaniel's expression flickered something that might have been guilt. No, he said carefully. I'm telling you that the choice you make matters more than any choice that came before it. Your ancestors chose the Covenant because they were dying, or desperate, or bound by duty. But you have the option to refuse, to leave, to reject what your blood is calling you toward. Can I really? Eleanor demanded. Can I really walk away when I feel like this? When my cells are singing with hunger for something only you can provide? When I have memories of 7 generations of women loving you, fearing you, needing you pressed into my bones? No, Nathaniel admitted. And there was profound sadness in that single word. You probably can't. Eleanor moved to the mirror and stared at her reflection. The silvering in her veins had spread, creating a map of stars beneath her skin. Her eyes were beginning to hold that strange luminescence she'd seen in Nathaniel's. And when she opened her mouth, she could feel the sharp points of fangs beginning to descend, just barely visible. How long do I have? She asked. Before I become whatever this is completely. 7 days, Nathaniel said. The blood covenant follows the old mathematics. 7 days from the first exchange, and the transformation will be complete. You'll be fully bound to me, and I will be bound to you in return. The wound will be sealed, my suffering will end, and you will step into an eternity that your bloodline has been preparing for since the moment your great-grandfather knelt in desperation and asked me to save his family. Eleanor turned from the mirror and found Nathaniel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not hunger, not quite love, something that existed in the terrible space between predator and beloved. And if I survive the transformation, Eleanor said slowly, if I become what you are, what happens then? Then, Nathaniel said, stepping closer, we discover whether the blood binding creates eternal torment or eternal redemption. We discover whether a love born in darkness can transcend its origins. We discover, he paused at her wrist, and Eleanor realized he was staring at the place where she'd bitten herself 3 days ago. The wound had healed, but faintly, very faintly, she could see the marks of her own teeth, permanent now, a signature in silver on her skin. Whether, he finished, the cursed Lord can finally be forgiven. The hunger surged again, and this time Eleanor didn't fight it. She pulled him close, felt his cold mouth meet hers, tasted blood and darkness, and the terrible sweetness of a fate she was choosing to embrace. Outside, the blood moon rose over Ravenscroft Manor, and in its light, the gargoyles seemed to smile. Chapter 5. The Revelation of Darkness. The library was candlelit when Nathaniel led her there on the 5th night of her transformation. Eleanor's hunger had become almost unbearable now, a roaring need that made her skin feel too small. Her bones ache as if they were being reforged from the inside. Her reflection in the mirrors had become something she barely recognized. Her eyes were fully silver now, luminous as moonlight on water, and the veins beneath her skin created a constellation map of her own impending death or rebirth. 5 days. She had 5 days left before the transformation completed, and she still didn't know why Nathaniel bore the wound that had slowly been healing with each feeding. didn't know why a priest had cursed him, didn't know why the covenant had been necessary in the first place. "You deserve the truth," Nathaniel said, moving through the library toward the restricted archive. He'd aged somehow in the past 5 days, not in appearance, but in bearing. The relief that had filled him after Eleanor's first offering had faded, replaced by something heavier. Dread, perhaps, or regret. The archive was vast, extending far deeper than Eleanor had realized on her first panic descent. But instead of leading her to the tombs, Nathaniel guided her to a chamber she hadn't seen before, a circular room with walls entirely covered in leather-bound journals. Thousands of them, perhaps tens of thousands, each spine labeled with a date. "Every moment of my existence," Nathaniel said, gesturing to the collection. "I began keeping records in 1671, when I realized I might live forever. I wanted to document it not for vanity, but for sanity, a way to anchor myself to reality when memory alone could no longer be trusted." He pulled a journal at random and opened it, revealing pages in elegant script. March 14th, 1702. "Watch the spring flooding from the east tower. The river is the color of old blood. I remember when this river ran clear. I remember when I could see my reflection in it. Now I see only darkness and hunger." Eleanor felt the weight of those centuries settle on her shoulders. Not her memories, but the simple comprehension of time endured 269 years of watching, of waiting, of hunger. "But this," Nathaniel said, moving deeper into the archive, "is what matters." He led her to a section where the journals transitioned from leather-bound to parchment, from neat script to desperate scratches, and finally, to a single illuminated manuscript, its pages bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. 1621, Nathaniel said quietly. "The year before the curse." Eleanor opened it carefully. The pages were written in Latin, adorned with illustrations of such grotesque beauty that she had to look away several times, but the images told a story her mind constructed, even as her eyes resisted. A young man, unmistakably, Nathaniel, but with mortal softness still clinging to his features, kneeling before a woman in a cathedral. The woman wore white, and her face was rendered with such tenderness that Eleanor understood immediately. This was love in its purest, most dangerous form. More pages showed them together, in gardens, in chambers, in candlelit intimacy. And then, a priest, an older man with eyes that burned with righteous fury, and finally, a scene of violence, blood pooling on cathedral stones, the woman falling, Nathaniel's mouth open in a scream that seemed to vibrate off the vellum itself. "Her name was Isabel," Nathaniel said, and his voice was barely audible. "She was mortal. I was something else even then, though I didn't fully understand it. The Ashford bloodline carries the old blood, Eleanor. We're descendants of those who made pacts with the threshold keepers, the ones who exist between shadow and sunlight. My mother hid it, tried to breed it out of the family line. But I was born with it anyway, the hunger, the strength, the inability to bear sunlight." He turned a page, revealing an illustration of the priest's face, his expression twisted with absolute certainty. "Father Matthias," Nathaniel continued. "He discovered what I was. Or rather, he discovered what he believed I was, a demon, a creature of the darkness, corrupting an innocent Christian woman. He forbade our union. Isabel refused to listen. We were to be married in secret, and then we would flee to France, to a place where the Inquisition's reach didn't quite extend." Eleanor watched as Nathaniel's hands trembled, holding the manuscript. In 4 centuries, she'd never seen him truly afraid. "The night before our wedding, Matthias came to me," Nathaniel said. "He offered me a choice. Renounce Isabel and accept baptism, holy water blessed by 7 priests, which would burn away the darkness and make me human again. Or refuse, and watch Isabel burn." Eleanor's breath caught. "I refused," Nathaniel said flatly, "because I didn't believe him. I thought it was a bluff, a test of faith. I thought the church's reach wasn't as long as he claimed. I was young and arrogant, and catastrophically wrong." He turned more pages, but Eleanor couldn't bring herself to look. She could imagine well enough what came next. "They burned her at dawn," Nathaniel said, each word a stone dropped into absolute silence. "She was innocent, human, beloved by God according to every doctrine of the church, and they burned her because she loved me, because I was what I was, and I had contaminated her by merely existing in her presence." "No," Eleanor whispered. "Yes." Nathaniel closed the manuscript with deliberate care. "And in that moment, the moment I felt her die, felt her consciousness simply extinguish. Something broke in me, something that hasn't healed in 4 centuries. Matthias was there, watching, believing himself righteous. And I killed him. Not quickly, not mercifully. I killed him the way a storm kills a tree. He held out his hand, and Eleanor saw the faint scars across his palm. His blood mixed with hers in my mouth. And in that mixing, something else occurred. The threshold keepers, the old blood, they recognized the magnitude of my transgression. I had spilled mortal blood in rage. I had murdered a priest, and most unforgivably, I had failed to protect the one I loved. Nathaniel moved to a section of the archive. Eleanor hadn't noticed an altar, really, with a single artifact, a crystal vial containing liquid that seemed to shift between gold and crimson. Holy water, Nathaniel said, blessed by the same 7 priests who consecrated the water that killed Isabel. But before Matthias could use it to save me, I took it myself. I drank it, every drop, because I wanted to burn. I wanted to suffer. I thought suffering was my penance, my right, my eternal price for failing her. Eleanor understood then. The wound at his heart, it wasn't from a hunter's attack in 1851. It was from himself. Centuries of holy water slowly poisoning him from the inside. A self-inflicted curse that transformed him into exactly the creature Matthias had feared. And then, Nathaniel continued, moving back toward the entrance, 300 years of agony, 300 years of that wound weeping, of hunger that could only be temporarily sated, of watching the world transform while I remained fixed in my grief and rage, until your great-grandfather came to me, desperate and dying, and offered me a covenant written in blood. To save you, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. To bind me, Nathaniel corrected. To give my suffering purpose. To transform my curse into stewardship. Your bloodline didn't save me, Eleanor. They redirected my damnation into something almost noble. 7 generations of willing sacrifice. And at the end, he turned to face her, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. The 7th generation was supposed to be the redemption. The prophecy Matthias cursed me with, the one he screamed as I tore him apart. Your darkness shall find light only when blood calls to blood, when mortal choice embraces immortal curse, when love is given freely rather than taken in rage. Eleanor felt the meaning settle into her bones. You were supposed to refuse me, Nathaniel said quietly. The covenant was designed so that if the 7th generation rejected the blood binding, I would be freed from the curse, not into life, but into true death, into peace. But you didn't refuse. You chose me. And now I'm going to complete the transformation, Eleanor finished. And somehow, that's going to redeem you. Or, Nathaniel said, and there was something almost fearful in his expression, it will simply bind 2 cursed souls together in eternal darkness. And we'll discover too late whether love born from blood magic and desperation can actually transcend its origin. Eleanor moved to him and took his hand. Where their skin touched, silver light bloomed her blood, answering his, recognizing him across the centuries, remembering Isabel's sacrifice, understanding finally what it meant to be an Ashford woman walking toward her fate with eyes wide open. Then we discover it together, she said. 4 days, Nathaniel. 4 days until I'm fully bound to you. And then we'll know if the threshold keepers were merciful or simply cruel. Outside, the blood moon was waning. And in the shadows of Ravenscroft, something ancient stirred, waiting to see if redemption or damnation would claim the cursed lord and his mortal bride. Chapter 6. The Gothic Trial. They came on the 7th dawn, the morning Eleanor's transformation was meant to complete. She woke to the smell of consecrated ground and burning sage, scents that made her newly heightened senses recoil in primal horror. Her skin was on fire, her bones felt like they were being remade from crystal, and every mirror in Ravenscroft had turned black, as if the manor itself was holding its breath. Nathaniel was already at the windows when she found him, his expression carved from stone. Vampire hunters, he said flatly. Not ordinary ones. The Inquisitorial Guard. They've been searching for me for 300 years. Below, circling the manor like wolves testing the fence of a pen, were figures in gray robes, marked with symbols that burned silver in Eleanor's vision. Protective wards, binding glyphs, the accumulated magic of centuries of sacred warfare. There were at least 20 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. How did they find us? Eleanor's voice sounded wrong, deeper, with harmonics she couldn't control. The transformation was nearly complete. Her humanity was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The Covenant's completion, Nathaniel said grimly. Blood binding creates resonance in the shadow realms. The moment you accepted transformation, every hunter within 200 miles would have felt it. They've been waiting for this, for me to be vulnerable enough to attempt a full union. They believe that if I'm bound to a mortal woman, I can be destroyed. Eleanor moved to the window and looked down at the hunters. One of them looked up, directly at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical blow. He was older, his gray robes marked with more symbols than the others, and his eyes held the certainty of absolute conviction. That's their leader, Nathaniel confirmed, following her gaze. Archbishop Matthias Crane, direct descendant of Father Matthias. He's been hunting me for 40 years, ever since he inherited his ancestors' journals and understood what I am, not just a vampire, but the original curse, the proof that damnation can wear a human face. The hunters began to move in unison, and Eleanor felt the manor shudder. They were chanting something, words in Latin that made her transformed blood scream in her veins. The protective wards that had kept Ravenscroft hidden for centuries began to crack, visible as fissures of darkness spreading across the sky. We have perhaps 2 hours before they breach the barriers, Nathaniel said, and he was already moving, pulling her away from the window. Gather what you need. We're leaving. Leaving? Eleanor felt hysteria rising. Where can we possibly go that they won't find us? If the binding creates resonance, it does, Nathaniel agreed, pulling her toward the library. But there's another option. One I've avoided for 4 centuries, because it requires a choice I didn't think I had the right to make. He moved to the archive, where the illuminated manuscript rested, and pulled it open to a page Eleanor hadn't seen before. It was written in a different hand. Older script, possibly Nathaniel's own from centuries past. The Threshold Keepers have offered sanctuary. They will shelter me in the shadow realms, outside of time, outside of mortality's reach. But the price is absolute. I must renounce my claim to this world entirely. I must surrender the right to walk in sunlight, to touch mortal flesh, to exist in any space where the living can find me. It is not death, but it is the closest approximation. Below this entry, in more recent script, perhaps from just before Eleanor's arrival, I have always refused this mercy, because refusing it meant I deserved my suffering. But if she comes, if the 7th generation actually chooses me, then perhaps I don't deserve to suffer alone anymore. Eleanor understood what he was asking. If you go into the shadow realms, and I complete my transformation, then you wouldn't be fully human anymore, but you wouldn't be fully vampire either, Nathaniel finished. You'd be liminal, threshold-born, capable of existing in both worlds. You could survive the shadow realms where I would hide. We could be together, but only in the spaces between, not in the mortal world, not in the full darkness, but in the eternal twilight where the old blood was always meant to live. That's not a life, Eleanor said. That's exile. Yes, Nathaniel acknowledged, but it's exile together, and it's infinitely better than what I deserved. Below them, the hunters' chanting intensified. The windows began to frost with holy water that burned like acid against the glass. Eleanor could feel the wards cracking further, could sense the moment when the manor's ancient protections would finally shatter. Or, Nathaniel said quietly, there's another choice. I could offer myself to them, let them bind me, kill me properly this time. The curse would die with me. You could complete your transformation as something new, not cursed, but enhanced. You'd have your humanity back, Eleanor. You could live a normal life, in sunlight, without the burden of my damnation. Absolutely not, Eleanor said, and the force of her refusal surprised them both. You've suffered for 4 centuries, Nathaniel. I'm not letting you martyr yourself now. Not when we've already paid the price of the covenant in blood. The first hunter breached the eastern wall, his form flickering as the wards tried to repel him. Others followed, and Nathaniel grabbed Eleanor's hand. Then we choose the threshold, he said. We choose the shadow realms. We choose each other, Eleanor finished. But as they ran toward the crypt, toward the deepest archive where the Threshold Keeper's portal supposedly waited, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The transformation's final moments were arriving, but it wasn't pain or burning, it was clarity. A sudden, devastating understanding that the choice Nathaniel was offering her wasn't mercy. It was another version of the same cage. The hunters were in the manor now, their footsteps thundering through corridors, their chanting making the very stones weep. Eleanor could smell them, their holy water, their blessed weapons, their absolute certainty that they were saving the world from damnation. And for just a moment, As Nathaniel pulled her down the final stairs, Eleanor wondered, what if they were right? The crypt opened before them like a mouth. The portal to the shadow realms waited a space of absolute darkness that didn't reflect light so much as consume it. Eleanor could feel the threshold keepers on the other side, ancient and patient, waiting to welcome her into eternal twilight. Nathaniel turned to her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked afraid. Last chance, he said. Refuse me. Choose humanity. Choose sunlight. Choose a life where you don't have to spend eternity in darkness because of a covenant your ancestor made in desperation. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but the hunters had reached the crypt. Their weapons blazed with holy fire, and the portal began to collapse, the threshold keepers withdrawing their offer, understanding that their sanctuary could not protect against the concentrated will of the inquisitorial guard. Eleanor and Nathaniel were running out of time, and then Eleanor made her choice not with words, but with blood. She bit into her own wrist hard enough to draw deep, let the transformed blood flow, and cast it not toward the portal but toward the approaching hunters. The blood ignited in midair, transforming into a wall of silver flame that screamed with the voices of 7 generations of Ashford women. The hunters recoiled, shielding themselves against the old blood's fury. And in that moment of reprieve, Eleanor pulled Nathaniel toward the portal and made the leap. As they fell into darkness, Eleanor heard Archbishop Crane's scream of rage, not the scream of a righteous man, but the howl of someone watching his certainty shatter. And then there was only darkness, and Nathaniel's hand in hers, and the threshold keeper's ancient laughter welcoming them home. Chapter 7. Blood and desire converge. The shadow realms had no sun and no stars, only an eternal twilight that seemed to emanate from the world itself. Eleanor's first awareness was of cold, not the burning cold of Nathaniel's touch, but something deeper, a cold that existed at the foundation of existence. She was standing in what appeared to be a garden, though the flowers were made of crystallized darkness, and the pathways were traced in silver light that hurt to look at directly. Nathaniel was beside her, but changed. His form seemed less solid here, more suggestion than substance, as if the shadow realms were slowly absorbing him back into themselves. "Welcome to the threshold," said a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Eleanor spun to find 3 figures materializing from the darkness. They were neither male nor female, neither young nor old, their features shifting like water each time she tried to focus on them. The threshold keepers. "You have made the choice," the central figure continued, and its voice held the weight of ancient authority. "The 7th generation has embraced the curse willingly. The blood binding is complete. But you understand the price?" Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but Nathaniel stepped forward, his form flickering dangerously. "The price was agreed upon 4 centuries ago," he said, and there was steel in his voice that Eleanor hadn't heard before. "The Ashford Covenant promised 7 generations of willing sacrifice in exchange for protection and stewardship. The 7th generation has fulfilled their obligation. I've fulfilled mine. The debt is paid. The debt is altered," the threshold keeper corrected. "The original covenant promised merely sustenance and safety, but you have created something new, a true binding. Not transaction, but union. Blood called to blood across centuries, and the mortal woman chose damnation rather than deny it. This changes the mathematics." Eleanor felt Nathaniel's hand find hers, and where their skin touched, the air began to shimmer with silver light. "What does that mean?" she asked. Her voice sounded strange here, resonating with harmonics that suggested she was no longer entirely human. "What have we created?" The threshold keepers moved closer, and Eleanor realized she could see through them. They were composed of the same twilight that made up the garden, the pathways, the very atmosphere of this place. They were the shadow realms themselves, made manifest in form. "Come," the central figure said. "We will show you." They led Eleanor and Nathaniel deeper into the garden, and as they walked, Eleanor began to see scenes playing out in the crystallized darkness of the flowers. Visions of the past, perhaps, or possible futures. She couldn't quite determine which. She saw herself and Nathaniel in the crypt at Ravenscroft, saw how when she offered her blood, something unprecedented occurred. Her mortal essence didn't simply accept his vampire nature. It transformed it. The curse that had been slowly poisoning him began to heal, not because she was removing it, but because her willing choice recontextualized it. The wound at his heart didn't disappear. Instead, it became sacred, a mark not of damnation but of price paid, of redemption earned through suffering. She saw the moment the hunters breached the manor, saw how her blood's fury, the accumulated rage of 7 generations of women who had served his darkness, created a barrier that was neither purely mortal nor purely immortal. It was something new, the old blood awakening after centuries of dormancy, and then the threshold keepers showed her something that made her gasp, a vision of what she was becoming, not vampire, not human, but something that existed in the liminal spaces between a creature of threshold and boundary, capable of walking between worlds, in ways neither pure immortal nor mortal could achieve. The blood binding had made her into a key, a bridge, a translator between the shadow realms and the world of the living. "You understand now," the threshold keeper said gently. "The 7th generation was never meant to simply pay a debt. The 7th generation was meant to transform it. Your willing choice has broken the cycle of curse and obligation. What remains is something unprecedented. A love born not from need or hunger or desperate bargaining, but from free will choosing damnation anyway." Eleanor looked at Nathaniel and saw him truly for the first time since entering the shadow realms. He was still beautiful, still haunted, still carrying the weight of 4 centuries of suffering, but something had changed in his expression. The crushing burden of isolation had lifted slightly, replaced by something almost like hope. "There is a price," the threshold keeper continued. "For such unprecedented transformation, there is always a price. You may remain here, in the shadow realms, in eternal twilight. You will not age, you will not sicken. You will exist together in perfect communion, never wanting, never hungering, never suffering the pain of mortality's passage. But you will be hidden from the world you came from. The living will not remember you. The hunters will eventually forget. You will become myth, then legend, then nothing at all. Or," the second threshold keeper said, stepping forward, "you may choose to return, to walk the mortal world in your new form, neither fully of the darkness nor fully of the light. You will be hunted. The inquisitorial guard will never stop searching for you. Your existence will always be in danger, always contested, but you will be present. You will matter. You will be able to change the world, because you will be able to walk in it." Eleanor's heart, which she could feel still beating, though she wasn't entirely sure why, began to race. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" she asked. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I want to stop running," he said. "I've been running whether physically or spiritually for 400 years. Every day in this world felt like borrowed time, like I was a creature that shouldn't exist, and I was defying some fundamental law by continuing to breathe." He turned to face her fully, and his gray eyes held something new. "Determination. But you chose me anyway. You chose damnation over safety, exile over normalcy. If you're willing to keep choosing me in the mortal world, then I'm done hiding. I'm done accepting that my existence is an aberration. Let them hunt. Let them rage. I'll spend whatever time we have left making it matter." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not pain, but opening. A door in her heart that had been locked since childhood finally swinging wide. She pulled him close, and where their bodies met, the shadow realms erupted into light. Not sunlight, something older, rawer, more fundamental. The light of creation itself, of possibility, of a love that transcended the mathematics of curse and covenant. The threshold keepers withdrew, their task apparently complete, and Eleanor and Nathaniel stood alone in the garden, holding each other as the shadow realms around them began to transform. The crystallized darkness became permeable. The pathways began to connect to other places, to Ravenscroft's crypt, to the mortal world beyond, to all the spaces where they might choose to exist. "When do we return?" Eleanor whispered against his chest. "Now," Nathaniel said. "Before the hunters regroup. Before they can prepare for what we've become." He took her hand, and together they began to walk back toward the threshold. But with each step, Eleanor felt the shadow realms settling into her bones, becoming part of her. She would carry this place with her always, the twilight, the ancient wisdom, the knowledge that she and Nathaniel had created something that defied every law that had previously governed immortality and mortality. As they reached the portal that would lead them back to Ravenscroft's crypt, Eleanor made a final realization. They weren't returning as victims or outcasts. They were returning as something new, something the world had never encountered before. Something that might actually be capable of redeeming a cursed lord, not through sacrifice, but through love that had been chosen freely and repeatedly, covenant after covenant, generation after generation, until it became something sacred. The portal opened before them, and the shadow realms released them with what almost sounded like blessing. Chapter 8. Covenant Acknowledged. They emerged from the crypt at midnight, when the blood moon hung full and red above Ravenscroft Manor. The hunters were waiting. Archbishop Crane stood at the center of the courtyard, surrounded by 30 members of the Inquisitorial Guard, their weapons blazing with holy fire that cut the darkness into stark geometry. When he saw Eleanor and Nathaniel ascending the stone steps, his expression twisted into something between triumph and revulsion. "The cursed lord returns," Crane called out, his voice amplified by some sacred magic that made Eleanor's transformed ears ache. "And he brings a corrupted mortal with him. Proof of his depravity. Proof that—" "I'm not corrupted," Eleanor interrupted, stepping forward. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to come from multiple registers simultaneously, her own voice layered with echoes of the 7 generations of Ashford women who had walked this path before her. "I'm transformed, and I'm standing here of my own will, not because I'm enslaved or cursed or damned, but because I chose this." Crane's face reddened. "You've been turned. Your soul has been consumed by—" "My soul," Eleanor said calmly, "has never been more intact. Do you know what I discovered in the Shadow Realms, Archbishop? I discovered the history your ancestor tried to erase. I discovered that Father Matthias didn't condemn a demon, he murdered a man for the crime of loving someone he deemed unworthy, and he cursed an entire bloodline to pay for that murder. 400 years of suffering for a crime of the heart." The hunters shifted uncomfortably. Some of them lowered their weapons slightly. Eleanor could feel the threads of their belief beginning to fray, the absolute certainty of their righteousness developing cracks. Nathaniel moved to stand beside her, and where he stood, the courtyard's shadows deepened. Not threateningly, simply as a statement of fact. Darkness was part of his nature. "Denying it would be like denying the sky, Eleanor," Crane said, and his voice held something almost like pity. "You've been enchanted. Let us help you. Let us perform the rite of unbinding. We can save you. We can return you to—" "To what?" Eleanor demanded. "To the life I had? To the loneliness? The sense that something was missing? That I didn't belong anywhere? I was incomplete before Nathaniel. And yes, the blood binding changed me. But transformation isn't corruption. It's becoming what you were always meant to be." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing the network of silver veins that now mapped her entire arm. Not the mark of a curse, but of purpose. Each vein glowed with faint luminescence, and as the hunters watched, the pattern shifted, reformed into symbols that Eleanor suddenly understood were the sigils of her ancestors, 7 generations of women, their names written in living light across her skin. "This is our covenant," Eleanor said, and her voice was the voice of all of them now. Magdalene Ashford, who had offered her blood in 1843, Catherine, who had done so in 1869, Margaret, Elizabeth, Sarah, Victoria, and finally Eleanor herself. 7 voices speaking as one. Not written in stone or paper, but in blood and bone and the fundamental structure of being. We chose this path not because we were trapped, but because we loved someone worth damnation. Crane's hand trembled as he raised his blessed weapon. Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes, whether to destroy her as a corrupted soul, or try to save her as a victim of vampiric thrall. "If you fire that weapon," Nathaniel said quietly, "you'll be the one breaking the covenant that has held since 1843. You'll be the one spilling innocent blood, for Eleanor Ashford is both transformed and innocent, bound by love rather than conquest. You'll commit the same sin your ancestor committed when he burned Isabel, and the threshold keepers will see it." As if in response to his words, the Shadow Realms trembled. The hunters could feel it, a presence, vast and ancient, pressing against the boundaries between worlds, watching with interest to see what would transpire. The threshold keepers had not abandoned Eleanor and Nathaniel after all. They were witnessing this moment, waiting to see if the blood binding would hold against the full force of the Inquisition's certainty. Crane lowered his weapon slightly. "What do you want?" he asked. And for the first time, Eleanor heard genuine uncertainty in his voice. "What does any of this accomplish? You're still damned. You'll still die eventually, still face judgment." "No," Eleanor said softly. "We've already faced judgment. The threshold keepers examined our covenant and found it not wanting. They blessed our union. The blood binding is sacred, Archbishop. Not in the way your church understands sacred, but in something older and more fundamental. It's the sacred of choice, of love given freely, of damnation accepted not out of weakness but out of strength." She stepped toward him, and the hunters instinctively moved to shield their leader. But Eleanor made no threatening gesture. Instead, she extended her hand, palm up, showing the pulse point at her wrist. My blood is still Ashford blood, she said. My ancestors made a covenant with the Threshold Keepers to protect a man your church deemed irredeemable. That covenant is now mine to honor. If you want to kill me, you'll have to explain to every Ashford soul who has ever lived, to the 7 generations of women whose names are written in my veins, why you believe their choice was a sin that needed to be erased. For a long moment, Crane simply stared at her. Eleanor could see the moment his absolute certainty finally fractured completely. He'd come to Ravenscroft to destroy a monster, to save a corrupted soul, to erase a 400-year-old curse. Instead, he found himself facing 7 generations of willing choice, written in blood and bone and sacred mathematics he had no framework to understand. I don't know what you are, he said finally, his voice hollow. I don't know if you're saved or damned, if this is redemption or damnation, wearing redemption's mask, but I know that I cannot kill you without becoming a murderer myself, and I've spent 40 years believing I was a holy man. He lowered his weapon completely and turned to his guard. Stand down, he commanded. The hunters exchanged confused glances but obeyed. Slowly, weapons were lowered, holy fire extinguished. The courtyard fell silent except for the wind moving through Ravenscroft's turrets. What will you do now? Crane asked Eleanor and Nathaniel. Will you walk the mortal world openly? Will you try to recruit others, build a coven, challenge the church's authority? No, Eleanor said. We'll live. We'll love. We'll exist in the spaces between, not hidden, but not demanding the world change to accommodate us. The covenant was always meant to be a private thing, a transaction between bloodlines and threshold keepers. Let the world believe you've destroyed us, if it brings you peace. Let them believe Nathaniel is dead and I've been freed. Some truths are too large for the world to hold. Nathaniel moved to Eleanor's side, and as he did, the courtyard's shadows shifted one final time. For just a moment, Eleanor could see the shadow realms bleeding through the eternal twilight garden, the threshold keepers watching with ancient satisfaction, the knowledge that something had been irrevocably altered in the relationship between mortality and immortality. Then it faded, and there was only moonlight, and the blood-stained stones of Ravenscroft's courtyard, and the Archbishop of the Inquisitorial Guard, accepting that some monsters were not meant to be slain. Go, Crane said finally. Take your darkness and your love and your threshold walking and go. I won't hunt you anymore. My war with you is finished. Eleanor squeezed Nathaniel's hand, and together they walked past the hunters, toward the gates of Ravenscroft, toward whatever existence waited for them in the liminal spaces between worlds. Behind them, Archbishop Crane watched until they disappeared into the shadows, and understood that he would spend the rest of his life wondering whether he had just witnessed redemption or been deceived by it. But he would never hunt again. Some certainties, once broken, can never quite be repaired. Chapter 9. Final Darkness. They didn't make it far. 3 miles beyond Ravenscroft's gates, on a stretch of moorland where the fog had begun to gather in earnest, the threshold keepers appeared. But they weren't alone. Eleanor felt them before she saw them, a wrongness in the fabric of the shadow realms, a discord that made her transformed blood scream warnings. Nathaniel stopped mid-step, his hand tightening around hers. The Voidwalkers, he said, and there was genuine fear in his voice for the first time since their bonding. I thought the threshold keepers had sealed them away centuries ago. The figures that emerged from the fog were nothing like the threshold keepers Eleanor had encountered in the shadow realms, where the keepers had been fluid and ancient and oddly benevolent. These creatures were sharp-edged and hungry and absolutely predatory. They appeared almost human, but their eyes held no light at all, no reflection, no consciousness. Only the absolute emptiness of things that had never learned to feel. The central Voidwalker stepped forward, and Eleanor recognized with a sick jolt that it wore the face of Archbishop Crane, or rather, a distorted mirror of his face. Stretched and wrong, as if it had been copied from a description, rather than from life. The threshold keepers promised sanctuary, the thing said in a voice that sounded like wind through abandoned tombs. But sanctuary is a cage, and the 7th generation binding has cracked the bars. Eleanor understood then. The threshold keepers hadn't told them everything. There were older things in the shadow realms than even the keepers themselves, creatures that existed in the spaces between spaces, that fed on the boundary breaking that Eleanor and Nathaniel's covenant had created. The blood binding is an abomination, the Voidwalker continued, circling them with movements that seemed to defy physics. 2 souls intertwined across the threshold, a mortal and an immortal merged into something neither world recognizes. Your union has weakened the barriers between realms. And now, We can walk freely into your precious mortal world." More voidwalkers emerged from the fog, dozens of them, each wearing a face Eleanor recognized. Hunters she'd seen in the courtyard. Her mother. Her father, whom she'd never met. Her great-grandfather, the one who'd made the original covenant. "No," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," the crane thing hissed. "Your blood binding has done what the threshold keepers feared. It's opened doors that should have remained sealed. For 400 years, the barriers held because the covenant was a transaction, clean and contained. But you transformed it into love, into something that transcends the mathematics of debt and payment. And love is chaos. Love is the opposite of order. Love shatters boundaries." Nathaniel pulled Eleanor behind him, but she knew it was futile. There was nowhere to run. They couldn't return to Ravenscroft. The manor was no longer under the Threshold Keeper's protection. They couldn't escape into the Shadow Realms. The Voidwalkers would simply follow. They were trapped in the liminal space they'd chosen to occupy, and that space was collapsing. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady, despite the terror screaming through her transformed blood. "We want what we've always wanted," the Voidwalker said. "To consume, to feed, to expand into the mortal world and feed on the boundary breaking that humans create daily. Every war, every murder, every act of cruelty that tears the fabric of civilization. Your blood binding is simply a convenient entry point. A wound in reality that we can pour through like locusts." Eleanor felt Nathaniel's hand in hers begin to tremble, not from fear, she realized, but from rage. 400 years of suffering, of isolation, of accepting damnation as his rightful burden. And now, at the moment when he'd finally found redemption, he was being told that redemption itself was the instrument of destruction. "There's one way to seal the breach," one of the Threshold Keepers said, materializing beside them. Eleanor recognized the voice, the central keeper who had guided them through the Shadow Realms. "One of you must sever the blood binding. Return to purely mortal or purely immortal. Close the door that your union has opened." "We can't," Eleanor said immediately. "If we sever the binding, Nathaniel returns to his curse," the keeper finished. "The holy water that has been slowly killing him will resume its work. He will have perhaps a month before the wound consumes him entirely, and you, Eleanor, will revert to pure mortality. You'll lose the power that the 7 generations granted you. You'll be ordinary again." "A month," Nathaniel said, looking at Eleanor. "1 month of your life, measured against 400 years of mine. That's a fair trade." "No," Eleanor said fiercely. "Absolutely not. Eleanor, listen to me." She pulled him close, ignoring the Voidwalkers circling them, ignoring the Threshold Keeper's hovering presence, ignoring everything except the man she'd chosen damnation for. "When I came to Ravenscroft, my mother had just died. I was empty. I was incomplete. And yes, the blood binding changed me. But it didn't make me incomplete in a different way. It made me whole. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to belong to something larger than myself. If I sever that binding, I don't return to who I was. I return to being a ghost, haunting my own existence." "Then we're damned," Nathaniel said quietly. "The Voidwalkers will pour through, and thousands will die, and it will be because of our love." Eleanor looked at the Threshold Keeper, understanding suddenly blooming in her mind. "You knew this would happen," she said. "When you blessed our union, when you told us to return to the mortal world, you knew the blood binding would weaken the barriers. You wanted it to." The Keeper didn't deny it. "The covenant was stagnant," the Keeper said. "For 400 years, it maintained equilibrium, but at the cost of preventing growth. The boundaries between worlds were meant to be permeable, Eleanor, meant to allow transformation and transcendence. But the Inquisition's holy water, the Hunter's wards, the Church's dogma, they all pushed toward absolute separation. Your blood binding was meant to begin the healing, to restore the natural flow between mortality and immortality. By unleashing the Voidwalkers," Eleanor said flatly. "By forcing a choice," the Keeper corrected. "You can sever the binding and save the mortal world, sacrificing yourself and Nathaniel in the process. Or you can stand in the breach between worlds and hold it closed with the power of your covenant. But that would require something neither of you has given yet." "What?" Eleanor demanded. "Your death," the Keeper said. "Both of you, choosing to die, not the slow death of Nathaniel's curse, or the empty life of Eleanor's severed binding, but true death, final and absolute. Your blood mingled at the threshold would create a seal that even the Voidwalkers cannot break. It would re-establish the boundaries between worlds. But you would be gone. Completely, No shadow realm existence. No liminal space. Simply gone. Nathaniel's grip on Eleanor's hand tightened so hard it should have hurt, but she felt only the solidity of his presence, the weight of 400 years of existence pressing against the precipice of annihilation. "No," he said. "There has to be another way. We just found each other. We just what?" Eleanor whispered. "Just earned redemption?" "Nathaniel, that's exactly what this is. Not redemption in the sense of escaping punishment, but redemption in the original meaning, being bought back, being reclaimed. If we die here, together, sealing the breach with our blood, then your 400 years of suffering finally means something, and my 7 generations of sacrifice finally reach their purpose. Eleanor, I won't let you. You don't have a choice," she said, and she pulled a dagger from the folds of her coat, one of the blessed weapons the hunters had abandoned in Ravenscroft's courtyard. "We both have to choose this, freely, just like we chose the covenant." She placed the blade against her wrist, over the pulse point where 7 generations of women had bled willingly. "Eleanor." "No." Nathaniel reached for the blade, but Eleanor was already cutting, letting her transformed blood pour onto the moorland. Where it fell, the earth began to glow with silver light. "Come with me," she said, extending her other hand to him. "One last covenant. Not between bloodline and vampire, but between 2 souls choosing to stop running, choosing to make their damnation mean something." Nathaniel looked at the Voidwalkers, at the Threshold Keepers, at the collapsing boundaries between worlds, and then he looked at Eleanor, at the woman who had inherited a curse and transformed it into redemption, who had walked into darkness and carried light with her. "Always," he said. He took her hand, and together they knelt at the threshold between worlds, letting their blood, mortal and immortal, freely given and absolutely willing, pour into the earth. The Voidwalkers screamed as the seal began to form. The Threshold Keepers withdrew, satisfied that the boundaries would hold, and Eleanor and Nathaniel, hand in hand, felt themselves dissolving into the silver light they'd created, becoming part of the threshold itself, eternal guardians of the breach between worlds. Their last conscious thought, as individuality faded into something larger and more transcendent, was a single word: together. Chapter 10. Eternal Resolution. There was no darkness in death. Eleanor opened her eyes, or perhaps she didn't open them. Perhaps she simply became aware of sight and found herself standing in a space that was neither the shadow realms nor the mortal world. It was both and neither simultaneously. A cathedral of light and darkness braided together, where time moved in spirals rather than lines, and presence was felt rather than seen. Nathaniel was beside her, but he was no longer bound by the shape of a man. Neither was she. They existed as pure consciousness, pure intention, pure love distilled to its absolute essence. And yet, somehow, Eleanor could still feel his hand in hers, not as physical touch, but as recognition, as the fundamental knowledge that her existence was intertwined with his in ways that transcended corporeal limitation. "Welcome to the threshold," the central keeper said, and Eleanor understood now that the keeper's voice had always been Nathaniel's voice, the echo of his consciousness across centuries. All the keepers were like that fragmented souls of the ancient dead who had chosen to become guardians rather than to rest. "You have transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal, between life and death, between individual and collective. You are now what the covenant always promised, eternal guardians of the space between worlds." Eleanor felt the weight of the responsibility settle into her being. She could sense the boundaries now, the thin, shimmering place where the mortal world and the shadow realms pressed against each other. She could feel the Voidwalkers pressing outward, their hunger boundless, their need to consume absolute. And she could feel Nathaniel beside her, his strength ancient and tested, his 4 centuries of suffering transformed into the fortitude required to hold back chaos. But she could also feel something else. The 7 generations of Ashford women, their presence no longer trapped in blood and bone, but woven into the very fabric of the threshold itself. Their sacrifice had become eternal. Their choice to serve the darkness had become a bridge of light. And Eleanor, the final generation, the one who had transformed a transaction into love, she was their culmination and their completion. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked, though speech was no longer necessary. Intention flowed between them like water finding its level. She simply wanted to know, and Nathaniel understood. "We endure," he responded, "not in words but in the fundamental language of existence itself. We hold the barrier. We prevent the Voidwalkers from consuming the mortal world. We exist in the eternal moment of decision, choosing again and again to keep the boundaries intact. For how long? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. The knowledge was written into her transformed nature. Forever, Nathaniel replied. And forever is not a prison, Eleanor. Forever is a gift. She felt the truth of it then. For 400 years, Nathaniel had experienced forever as torment the burning wound at his heart, the hunger that could never be fully sated, the isolation of being a creature that shouldn't exist. But now, fused with Eleanor at the threshold, forever took on different meaning. It was deep time, ancient time, the kind of time that allowed for genuine transformation. In forever, a cursed lord could become a guardian. In forever, a mortal woman could transcend her mortality and matter in ways the living world could never comprehend. She turned her awareness outward, toward the mortal world, and saw through the boundaries as if they were transparent. She saw Ravenscroft Manor, where Archbishop Crane was burning Nathaniel's journals, trying to erase the evidence of 400 years of existence. She saw the hunters returning to their homes, carrying doubt like a wound that would never quite heal. She saw the world continuing on, unaware of how close it had come to being consumed by voidwalkers, unaware of the sacrifice that had saved it. And she saw her own grave, a memorial stone placed in a cemetery near Ravenscroft, bearing her name and the words beloved, transformed, eternal. The mortal world would remember Eleanor Ashford as a woman who had been cursed and lost, but in the threshold, she was infinitely more. Don't mourn the loss, Nathaniel said, sensing her contemplation of her own memorial. The living always mourn. It's part of how they make meaning of things they can't understand. Let them believe you're dead. Let them believe we both are. We've given them a story they can accept, a curse broken, a monster destroyed, a woman saved from darkness. But we know the truth, Eleanor responded. We know that darkness wasn't destroyed. We became it. We chose it. And in choosing, we transformed it. A disturbance rippled across the threshold, and Eleanor felt Nathaniel's attention sharpen. One of the voidwalkers was testing the barrier, pressing against it with hunger that tasted like rust and rot, and the absence of everything good. Together, Eleanor and Nathaniel moved toward the breach, not as separate entities, but as a single intention, wearing two names. They pressed back against the voidwalker, and it retreated, frustrated by the solidity of their union. The barrier held. This is what we do now, Nathaniel said as they settled back into their eternal vigil. We stand guard. We hold the line. We remind the voidwalkers that some doors are not meant to open. Some boundaries exist for the protection of both worlds. But Eleanor sensed something deeper in his intention, something he wasn't quite saying aloud. You're saying this is redemption, she said slowly. You're saying that for you, damnation transformed into purpose is actual redemption. Not escape, not forgiveness, but meaning. Yes, Nathaniel confirmed, and there was something almost like peace in his response. For 400 years, I believed myself irredeemable. Father Matthias cursed me, and I accepted that curse as my eternal truth. But then you came, and you chose damnation beside me, and suddenly my suffering had context, meaning, purpose. That is the only redemption that actually matters, not being saved from darkness, but being saved into it. Being shown that darkness itself can be sacred. Eleanor understood then the full mathematics of the covenant. Her great-grandfather hadn't made his bargain simply to save his family's bloodline from extinction. He had made it because somewhere, in some deep and ancient part of the Ashford genetics, there was recognition of what Nathaniel was, and there was compassion for it. And there was the understanding that love given willingly, even love given toward damnation, was the only redemption possible for souls caught between worlds. 7 generations of women had served that understanding. 7 generations of willing sacrifice had culminated in Eleanor, who had been brave enough to ask the question her mother had fled from. What if love is worth damnation? What if choosing darkness is its own form of light? The threshold sang around them, a frequency that existed at the edge of human hearing. Eleanor could feel the boundaries between worlds settling into their proper configurations, strengthened by the presence of 2 souls who had literally become the threshold. Not guards in the sense of military defense, but guardians in the older sense, keepers of sacred boundaries, protectors of the spaces where transformation occurred. I love you, Eleanor said, knowing that love in this form was something neither mortal nor immortal could quite comprehend. It was love that transcended all language, all desire, all the needs and hungers that drove both the living and the undead. It was love that had been chosen freely, repeatedly, across generations and centuries, and the absolute finality of death itself. I love you, Nathaniel replied, and I will love you forever. Not as a curse, not as obligation, not as hunger, but as the fundamental truth of my existence. You are the reason 400 years of suffering finally became meaningful. And together, they settled into their eternal watch, standing at the threshold between worlds, holding back chaos with nothing but the power of their covenant, a love born in darkness, refined through sacrifice, and transformed into something sacred. Above them, in the mortal world, the blood moon continued its eternal cycle. In Ravenscroft Manor, the gargoyles on the roof seemed to smile, as if they alone understood the truth, that the cursed lord had finally found his redemption, not by escaping damnation, but by embracing it completely, and by finding a partner willing to share that embrace for eternity. And in the shadow realms, the threshold keepers withdrew into their ancient rest, satisfied that the boundaries would hold, that the void walkers would remain contained, and that two souls who had learned to love in the darkest circumstances would endure as eternal guardians of the space between. The covenant was complete, the debt was paid, and Eleanor Ashford and Nathaniel Ashford, cursed lord and threshold walker, guardian and beloved, began their endless vigil, hand in hand, heart in heart, darkness in darkness, together in the eternal moment of choosing each other again and again and again. Forever, as it turned out, was not a prison. It was a gift. Chapter 11. Twilight Covenant. 100 years later, the mortal world had forgotten Eleanor and Nathaniel Ashford entirely. That was the nature of true death, not the erasure of the body, but the erasure of memory. Time wore away at the edges of even the most sensational stories, and the tale of a cursed lord and a threshold-walking woman eventually became folklore, then whispered legend, then nothing at all. But the threshold remembered. Eleanor stood at the boundary between worlds, watching as a young woman in modern dress approached Ravenscroft Manor. She was Ashford blood. Eleanor could feel it in the way the manor responded to her presence, in the way the ancient stones seemed to lean toward her like flowers toward sunlight. A descendant, perhaps 10 generations removed now, carrying the diluted but persistent echo of the original covenant. Nathaniel materialized beside her, though materialized was the wrong word. He had never left. He simply became visible to Eleanor's awareness, the way one might suddenly notice a familiar face in a crowd. She doesn't know, Eleanor observed, sensing the young woman's confusion and wonder as she explored the decrepit manor. The covenant has faded so far that she doesn't recognize what she is. No, Nathaniel agreed. The bloodline has been diluted by mortals who knew nothing of the threshold. But the blood still remembers. And when she needs it most, the memory will surface. They watched as the girl, her name was Sophie, Eleanor perceived through the threads of connection that bound all Ashford women together, moved through the foyer, where Eleanor had first encountered Nathaniel. The portraits still hung on the walls, dust gathering on their gilded frames, and the grand portrait of Lord Adrian Ashford still dominated the mantelpiece, his gray eyes seeming to follow Sophie with recognition even across the centuries. "Will she make the covenant?" Eleanor asked. "That's not for us to determine," Nathaniel responded. "We can only hold the threshold and wait. If the blood calls to her, if she feels the pull toward darkness and chooses to answer it, then the covenant will renew itself. But if she turns away, if she chooses to remain purely mortal, then the bloodline will continue its decline, and eventually, there will be no more Ashfords to guard the threshold." Eleanor felt the weight of that possibility. The threshold keepers had been explicit about the mathematics. Eternal guardianship required eternal renewal. Every 100 years or so, an Ashford descendant would be drawn to Ravenscroft, called by blood memory and genetic destiny, and they would choose consciously or unconsciously whether to accept the calling or reject it. And if they all reject it? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. She'd had a century to contemplate these questions. After all, then the Voidwalkers will eventually break through, Nathaniel said simply. And the mortal world will fall. But that won't happen for generations yet. The blood is strong, stronger than it should be, perhaps, because of what we did. Our sacrifice bought time, Eleanor. Centuries of time. He moved to the window, and Eleanor followed, both of them peering through the veil between worlds at the manor's grounds. The graveyard was visible now, where Eleanor's memorial stone still stood, weathered but intact, and beside it, a new stone had been placed for Nathaniel, even though his body had never existed to bury. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, "about what the Keeper told us, about how the covenant was never meant to be a transaction, about how love is the only true redemption." "Yes?" Nathaniel's attention sharpened. "I've been thinking that maybe we were wrong to accept this role. Maybe we should have let the Voidwalkers come. Maybe the mortal world deserves to face its own darkness rather than have it contained for them. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. Eleanor could feel his processing the way Threshold Guardians experienced thought, which was less like human cognition and more like the slow turning of vast celestial bodies, considering gravity and momentum and the long arcs of consequence. "You're testing me," he said finally. "You're asking whether I've truly transcended the guilt that bound me for 400 years. Whether I can accept that what we do here, holding the boundaries, containing the chaos, is not penance but purpose." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "I needed to know that you're not still punishing yourself, that you're not serving the threshold because you believe you deserve to suffer eternally." "I'm not," Nathaniel said, and Eleanor could feel the truth of it in the fundamental frequencies of his being. 400 years of suffering taught me that punishment doesn't lead to redemption, only love does. And I love this work, Eleanor. I love holding the boundaries. Not because I'm atoning for Isabel's death, that atoning will never be complete, and I've made peace with that, but because in holding the threshold, I'm protecting the possibility of transformation. I'm ensuring that other souls caught between worlds might find redemption the way I did. Through willing choice, through love freely given, through the decision to embrace damnation rather than flee it. Eleanor understood then the final piece of their covenant. They weren't servants of the threshold keepers, or reluctant guardians bound by obligation. They were volunteers, choosers, the same way Eleanor had chosen damnation. Nathaniel was choosing to continue serving long after death had released him from all earthly obligation. "I want to renew the covenant," Eleanor said suddenly. "Not because we're bound to, but because I want to. I want to choose you again. I want to choose this. I want to choose the threshold, the darkness, the eternal watch. Not for penance, for love." Nathaniel turned to her, or rather, his attention crystallized in a way that suggested focus and presence, an absolute presence. "You're asking me to marry you," he said, understanding immediately what she meant. "Again," Eleanor confirmed, "and again, for every 100 years that passes. I want to renew our covenant at the threshold, in the presence of the keepers, before all the accumulated dead who have ever served this boundary. I want to make it a ritual, a celebration, something that transforms this vigil from duty into devotion." "Yes," Nathaniel said, and the threshold resonated with the force of that single word. "Yes, Eleanor Ashford. Yes, forever. Yes, always." And so, they began to prepare. The threshold keepers, sensing the intention, moved to assist. They gathered the accumulated souls of all those who had ever served the boundary, centuries of dead souls, lives lived in service to the space between worlds. Slowly, gradually, the boundary transformed into something beautiful. Not a barrier, but a cathedral. A space where the sacred mathematics of love and choice and eternal devotion could be celebrated. On the mortal side, Sophie felt a strange compulsion to remain in Ravenscroft. She began cleaning, restoring, bringing the manor back to something resembling its former grandeur. She didn't understand why she felt driven to do this. It made no logical sense. But her blood knew. Her body remembered what her conscious mind had forgotten. She was preparing the threshold for a renewal that would ripple through 7 generations of blood, past and future. And at midnight, when the blood moon rose full and red above the manor, Eleanor and Nathaniel renewed their covenant, not with words, but with the fundamental language of souls who had transcended death and discovered that love, true, absolute, freely chosen love, was the only redemption that actually mattered. The threshold sang with their union, and in the mortal world, all the Ashford women who had ever lived past and future, those who had accepted the calling and those who had rejected it, felt the resonance. It was a reminder, a calling, a promise that whatever darkness they might face, whatever damnation they might choose, there was always love waiting at the threshold. As dawn broke, Eleanor and Nathaniel settled back into their eternal watch, but the weight of it had changed. It was no longer burden but blessing. They had transformed duty into devotion, obligation into choice, curse into covenant. And in the space between worlds, where the sacred and profane braided together in eternal complexity, 2 souls who had learned to love in darkness continued their endless vigil, not as punished souls seeking redemption, but as redeemed souls who had chosen damnation anyway, and found it to be the truest form of grace. The blood moon waned, the threshold held, and Eleanor Ashford and Nathaniel Ashford, cursed Lord and Threshold Walker, beloved and guardian, eternal and infinite, continued their endless dance at the boundary between worlds, choosing each other in every moment. transforming darkness into light through the alchemy of a love that transcended all mortality, all immortality, all understanding. The covenant would endure, the blood would remember, and as long as there were Ashford women willing to answer the call of the threshold, the boundaries between worlds would hold. Forever, as it turned out, was just the beginning.